the History and Philosophy of Science in Cambridge, Professorial Fellow at Christ College, Cambridge, and Director of the Darwin Correspondence Project. He has published many books and articles on the history of the sciences during the late 18th and 19th centuries, including the much lauded Victorian Sensation, the extraordinary publication, reception, and secret authorship of vestiges of the natural history of creation. And if I'm not mistaken, he's currently working on a short book on current issues facing the history of science. The second talk will be delivered by Peter Burke. Peter Burke is a Professor Emeritus of Cultural History and Life Fellow of Emmanuel College at Cambridge University. He's a Fellow of the British Academy and has published some into many languages, from Culture and Society in Renaissance Italy, 1972, to The Polymath, A Cultural History from Leonardo da Vinci to Susan Sontag, which was published last year. Since the publication in 2015 of his book, What is the History of Knowledge?, Burke has emerged as a leading voice in the development of and debates on the new field of the history of knowledge. And today he will take this exploration of the history of knowledge a step further in his paper, Emancipating the History of Knowledge. So please, Peter, the floor is yours. You have to unmute yourself, Peter, because we cannot hear you yet. So on the top of your screen on the right side, you see a microphone icon and you can click it, and then, yes, now we can hear you.
Good morning, everybody. Can you hear me?
We can hear you,
Great.
Peter.
Fine. So, as you all know, studies of the history of knowledge, formerly neglected, have proliferated in the last 30 years or so, accompanied by the foundation of centers for its study in Berlin, in Lund, and other places. And this approach to the past emerged principally, though not completely, from the history of science. And I think it was in part a response to a certain discomfort on the part of some historians of science, especially if they worked on science outside the West or before the so-called scientific revolution. A discomfort because they didn't want to call these knowledges science, and they didn't want to call them unscientific, and a compromise was to call them forms of knowledge. One might say that this, therefore, emancipated disciplines like astrology, alchemy, or psephology, in the sense of making it intellectually respectable to study their history. And now turning to an area I'm more comfortable with, humanities and social sciences. Some studies in those kinds of knowledge have often followed the model of the history of the natural or exact sciences, sometimes very much to their advantage. I'm thinking especially of the study of the spaces of knowledge, surely inspired originally by Gaston Bachelard and Michel Foucault. But instead of looking at clinics and laboratories and observatories, we, if I may say, we look at the spaces of archives, of libraries, and of seminars. And some scholars have even taken over from Thomas Kuhn both the idea of paradigm and that of revolution. I'm thinking particularly of the late Georg Iggers, who published a study of the Ranke revolution in historical writing as a change of paradigm in the Kuhnian sense. So if I may speak here on behalf of all historians of non-scientific knowledges, I think we should be extremely grateful to the philosophers and historians of science for their inspiration. And following their model is assisted by certain analogies between scientific knowledge and non-scientific knowledge. But as usual, analogies are accompanied by disanalogies, including the ones that I should like to emphasize in what follows. And for this reason, I think the time has come for historians of knowledge to emancipate themselves from the history of science, that is, to leap out of the maternal pouch, to examine cases of knowledges which are rather dissimilar to scientific ones. Listeners may want to know in advance where I'm speaking from. I have to say, I have never practiced the history of science, though I read books about it. I was trained to be a general historian or plain historian, and the disciplines that I've written about in particular, the history of historical writing, a bit about sociology and anthropology. And since innovations and turns in historiography take place, I believe, in different ways, and even for substantially different reasons from innovations and turns in the history of science, I think a case study of these changes may be illuminating. So, although the discipline of history develops like the natural sciences by fresh research, which calls earlier conclusions into question and tries to replace them, I think in other respects, historical knowledge diverges from the paradigm of knowledge in science. Although there was a time, as you know, in the early 20th century when historians were convinced that their discipline was a science and that their conclusions were objective. Today, though, it's more or less agreed by the community of historians who disagree about so much else, that the divergences from the model of natural science, or maybe the models of the various natural sciences, are too great for us to call history a science at all. They are largely a result of the fact that, like anthropologists and sociologists, we're concerned with people like ourselves who happen to live in different cultures or in different periods. So individual and group standpoints are important in their work, for better or for worse. Actually, I believe for both better and worse. In their pursuit of knowledge, historians remain close to everyday life, while science has become increasingly remote from everyday life thanks to its very success, observing what cannot be seen with the naked eye through microscopes, telescopes, and then more and more complex forms of apparatus. Hence, the language of historians to this day generally remains close to ordinary language, while scientists have had to develop many specialized languages that separate them from outsiders. Now, in what follows, I shall offer 6 doubtless oversimple contrasts between historical knowledge and knowledge of the natural sciences. All the 6 points are well known in themselves, but I thought I should present them here once again in order to assist in collective thinking about their implications. And so, point 1, historians still love the classics. I'm thinking of Jakob Burckhardt's book on the Renaissance. I'm thinking of Johann Hosinger's Waning of the Middle Ages. When I say we, I'm thinking in the first place of professional historians, whether they work on the same problems as these classics that they admire or not. For example, Robert Darnton, whose own work focuses on France in the 18th century, read Burke's book on the Renaissance when he was still working as a journalist. And as he remarked in an interview, I'll quote, "I knew that I could not read this book openly before the other reporters, so I hid it inside a copy of Playboy. And I still think it's the greatest history that I've ever read," end of quote. So we love the historical classics despite their faults. Many, if not most, of the conclusions put forward in those two books by Burke and Hausinger have been refuted by their successors. Indeed, Hausinger took his part in refuting some of the conclusions of Burke. But in a sense, that doesn't matter. That is, we love the classics because not because they were always right, not even because they wrote well, though many of them did write well, but for the insights of their authors and their superlative historical imagination, and gifts that they share with classics of fiction such as War and Peace. Second point, I think shifts of interest, asking new questions and exploring new topics are more important for the development of the discipline of history than the refutation of earlier views, although a lot of refutation of earlier views, revisionism, we call it, takes place. In other words, asking new questions has been more important for the development of the discipline than finding new answers to old questions. And looking back from today, it is, of course, abundantly clear that the last 100 years has seen a gigantic expansion of the topics on which historical research is considered to be academically respectable. In Britain in the 1950s, for example, I was a student at Oxford at that time, and social history was just becoming respectable in the wake of economic history that had joined political history some decades earlier. Cultural history wasn't, despite having been practiced by those historians I mentioned already, Burke and Hausinger. In Britain, unlike the Netherlands, it still wasn't really accepted. I think not even widely accepted in the 1980s. In the 1980s, when I was appointed a reader in history at Cambridge, I had the right to devise my own job description, and I said I wanted to be the reader in cultural history. I believe that was not the name of any academic appointment in Britain at that time. I must confess, too, that I chose the title partly to annoy Geoffrey Elton, who happened to be the most powerful person in the history faculty at that time, because he only really believed in political history. But since the 1980s, so many turns have taken place in historical studies that just thinking about them together is enough to make one feel quite dizzy. So the linguistic turn, followed by the quantitative turn, followed by the emotional turn, the global turn, the performative turn, the practice turn, the visual turn, the non-human turn. I haven't run out, but I think that is quite enough for the moment. So today it appears that everything in the world has a history and that somebody's somewhere trying to write it. It was mentalities, then bodies, sex, and then gender, the senses, the landscape, and even for big historians, a history of the universe beginning with the stars. Third point, I think these shifts of interest have not been provoked, or have not only been provoked by earlier discoveries, or even by reactions against views previously considered to be orthodox. They're essentially the result of changes in our present day, thus encouraging historians to look at the past from new angles. 100 years ago, for example, that time of rapid inflation encouraged historians to write books about the history of prices. In the 1950s, discussions of the world population explosion encouraged the rise of a new discipline or sub-discipline, that is, historical demography. Today, it's obvious enough what drives the history of the environment. And closer to today's theme, the many public discussions of the knowledge economy, the information society, and so on, underlie this growing interest in what some of us call the history of knowledge. So far as I know, the history of the sciences doesn't generally follow this model, with an obvious exception for the history of medicine, with the responses to the challenge of new illnesses provoking new research, as we are all too well aware today. So for this reason, I'd suggest that although all histories of knowledges must strive for some balance between internalist explanations and externalist explanations, I believe the balance swings towards internalism in the history of the sciences, and it swings towards externalism, a more contextual approach in histories of the social sciences and the humanities. Fourth point, historians still work in a more traditional manner than natural scientists. They're more like artisans. Research by individuals is still the norm rather than research by teams. Articles by more than 2 authors are extremely rare in the humanities, just as they are extremely common in the natural sciences. Of course, the contrast has something to do with the fact that the natural sciences are better funded, so you can afford to assemble a team to crack a problem. But the differences also have a lot to do with differences in our objects of study. Even when there is a collective investigation of the kind that was adopted in France by some members of the Annales group, and which I believe is encouraged particularly in the Netherlands. Imagine, for example, this is a real case, a collective investigation of nobilities in medieval and early modern Europe. But that took the form of individuals making independent case studies and publishing those case studies under their own names, although they would meet from time to time to compare and contrast their various conclusions. Now, in most cases, that still seems to be the most appropriate way of going about our business. Again, archives may be the historian's laboratories, but they do differ from laboratories in key respects. To begin with, the documents were originally assembled for the purposes of somebody else. Often, though of course not always, a bureaucrat. And the historian may go to the archives with a particular question in mind, but when those dusty files arrive on one's desk, one quickly becomes aware not only that the creators of these documents might not be totally trustworthy, but much more important, I think, they were answering their questions. They had their own agenda, very different from the agenda of the person opening the file 300 years later. So we work by taking notes on those files, and then from the notes, we create files of our own, and then our books and articles. I think if we are close to another intellectual activity, it would be translators from one language into another, because we transform the information we find into answers to our own questions. We try to translate between the past and the present. We turn the stories we find in the documents into our stories. At the same time, just like translators between one language and another, we try to remain aware of the problem of untranslatability, the divergence between our interests and theirs, our attitudes and theirs, if you like, our mentality and theirs. So, as often has been remarked, the closest parallels to historical method come from outside the academic world altogether. I mentioned translators, but of course, there are two other famous parallels of this kind. Historians are like detectives because they develop suspicions, they follow clues, and they focus on evidence that will stand up in public. But we also resemble novelists, since we too are producers of narrative. Even the most analytical historians present at least some of their conclusions in the form of a story, because they're interested in the rise of something or the decline and fall of something, or a crisis of something, and so on. Move now to the fifth point. I began by saying historians of knowledge need to emancipate themselves from the model of science. And of course, this is the moment to confess that, as you know, some people have done it already. My forecast of the future, rather like most forecasts of the future, is not much more than an extrapolation from the recent past. And looking back at that recent past, the most obvious way in which historians of knowledge have already diverged from the scientific knowledge, from the scientific model, is the interest shown by many of them in know-how, in practical knowledges and implicit knowledges. Of course, I know that historians of science have taken great interest in the know-how of artisans, but I'm thinking now of many more varieties of practical knowledge. Hunters, cooks, merchants, administrators, and connoisseurs of art each have their own knowledge, their own methods. And in some cases, for example, the case of the connoisseur, a crucial role is played by what they call the eye, a form of intuition which is almost certainly the result of many experiences that have been forgotten by the person experiencing them, but inform the judgments that they make. It's a nice case of tacit knowledge. My sixth and longest point is the following. For historians, I think the study of practical knowledges is important in two ways. It not only makes contributions to this new field of the history of knowledge, if it is a field, come back to that, but more important, it helps to integrate the history of knowledge into history in general. And it does that by revealing the place of information and knowledge, not to mention the place of ignorance, in the process of decision-making in all the spheres I've mentioned and many more. And so what I want to do now in the final part of this paper is to discuss decision-making in three practical worlds. First, the world of business, then the world of politics, and finally, the world of war. So, historians of business will try to analyze decisions taken either by medieval merchants or by modern CEOs, and think about the kinds of information that they require to make good decisions. In the first case, they need information about the products of rival companies, hence the importance and the long history of industrial espionage. In the second place, of course, they need information about the needs and the tastes of potential consumers. That was already a concern of the Dutch East India Company in the 17th century, but they were a remarkable pioneer in this respect. Of course, this kind of research only became normal in the 1920s with the rise of agencies for market research. And then in the third place, the merchant or the CEO needs information about their own enterprise. They need to know about its products, but they also need to know about its employees and its communication system. Storing this knowledge requires a filing system already made visible in the literal sense in a 16th century sketch of the office of Jacob Fugger of Augsburg, with all the drawers for letters to and from the branches of the firm in different cities in Europe. But of course, in the 19th century, as businesses became larger and larger, the information system and the retrieval system for that information became more and more sophisticated with the rise of the card index and the filing cabinet. But even so, businesses faced, of course they still face, the problem of what has become known, I think originally by sociologists, as organizational ignorance. One form of this is the loss of valuable information whenever an employee who is experienced leaves the firm, because that employee has masses of implicit knowledge. If it's not made explicit in the form of detailed instructions for that person's successors, it's simply lost to the firm. Another form of organizational ignorance, still more important perhaps, is the result of failures in communication. Workers on the shop floor of a factory know things about the business that the managers don't know, just as the managers know things about the business that the workers don't know. But very often, one group does not communicate that kind of knowledge to the other group. Hence, the chairman of Hewlett-Packard is supposed to have sighed, if only we knew what we know at HP. Turning now to politics and the rise of bureaucracy in early modern Europe, which was an attempt to make governing more efficient by collecting, storing, and using information in a more systematic manner than before. Recently, the German historian Arndt Brendeke re-examined the empire of Philip II of Spain from the point of view of information management. And again, recently, Jake Saul, I should say a former student of mine, described the chief minister of Louis XIV, the minister Jean-Baptiste Colbert, as the information master, because he commissioned surveys of France and was also concerned with ways in which information could be rapidly retrieved whenever it was needed in the service of practical decision making. And of course, since the early modern period, the filing systems of government departments and agencies, think of the FBI, the KGB, and so on, they have proliferated beyond belief or even beyond imagination. But there was, and I suppose still is, a major downside to this proliferation of information in the political sphere. Philip II of Spain was an early victim of information overload, complaining in his letters to his daughters of those devils, my papers, which never gave him a moment's rest. And then, as the great historian Fernand Braudel showed 70 years ago now, Philip was also victim of the communication system of his day, a horse-drawn communication system, or crossing the sea with sailing ships, which meant important information that was sent from Madrid to Mexico City or from Lima back to Spain would never arrive in time for the rapid action that was actually required by the situation. In any case, a vast empire offered equally vast opportunities for organizational ignorance. And as you may well imagine, officials in possession of key information might prefer not to pass it upwards, fearing the consequences of telling their superiors something that they knew that their superiors would not want to know. And finally, we arrive at the history of war, because wars are won or lost by knowledge as well as by bravery, discipline, and technology. In the fog of battle, sometimes literal, sometimes metaphorical, the commander with superior knowledge of the terrain and the enemy, what the Duke of Wellington called knowledge of what's going on the other side of the hill, this has a very distinct advantage. But useful military knowledge also happens to include knowledge of the past, not to prepare for the previous war, as generals have so often been accused of doing, but simply to be aware of dangers to avoid because some kinds of situation recur. The German invasion of Russia in 1941 failed for at least some of the same reasons as the French invasion of Russia in 1812. And again, the British, Russian, and American invasions of Afghanistan, the commanders and the troops also made some of the same mistakes for lack of local knowledge. Cases like these all lead me to conclude that the creation of a new historical field, history of knowledge, with its own centers and its own journals, although it's valuable, it's not the highest priority for history of knowledge today. I think what is overwhelmingly more important is the recognition of the roles of many forms of knowledge in general history, or to speak like the French, of total history. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Peter, for your talk on the history of knowledge. I just wanted to do a brief intervention before we move on to you, Jim Secord, because we've been experiencing some technical problems with the connection, etc. Some people send messages in the chat. So I wanted to ask all the participants if it's a downside of doing everything online, but if during the talks you could switch off your video, because I think it makes the connection with the speaker and respondents better. So if you could turn off your video, I hope it works better for all of you who are viewing. And you can, of course, turn it on again in the plenary discussion if you have a question, etc. Okay, so that was the intervention. Please, Jim, we're looking forward to hearing from you.
Okay, well, thank you. Thanks first very much to Lucas for organizing this and to Peter for his very interesting talk. I wanted to start by really asking a question, and that is, it's the question that I think Peter poses, which is, should historians of knowledge leap from the maternal pouch of the history of science? It's an image I rather like, in fact. Peter says yes, but I think the problem here is potentially rather different. History of knowledge, in fact, is not actually in the pouch at all. In other words, it's not a young kangaroo, but rather history of knowledge is an attempt to invent a new kangaroo. History of science in this picture is rather an overgrown joey that is inhabiting the pouch of this newly proposed kangaroo. So I suppose I'm skeptical about the kind of way that the topic is posed in the first place. And I'm skeptical in that sense about the case for jumping. The bigger question, which I'll come to at the end, as Peter did, is, do we need the new kangaroo at all? I come to this discussion very much as a historian of science, and because the issues are many, I'm going to take up Peter's 6 points very briefly in order. It's often said, as Peter does, that humanists and scientists differ in their love for the classics of their fields, though in my experience, most professional historians really engage deeply, primarily with very little that's published before the 1970s. And indeed, the idea, looking back, the idea of a classic itself, as Peter fully knows, has a history. It's really, the sciences really stop thinking of themselves as permanent long-term works, really at various periods, but particularly I think after 1800, this becomes increasingly difficult. In any event, I think the issue is more about making how the distinction is made rather than using it to make a case about separating off certain forms of history of knowledge and history of science. Peter's second distinction is about how shifts in interests occur in science as compared with the humanities. Despite what he says, I don't think that science has ever primarily worked by a process of refutation. Instead, scientists, rather like scholars in the humanities, move forward by posing new questions. Scientists don't ever really talk about turns, but their priorities do change dramatically while simultaneously building on what goes before. I would also suggest that in the humanities, the kind of dramatic theoretical changes that we often talk about often actually operate much more slowly, especially in research-intensive fields such as history. Third, I wonder if scientists are really more insulated from more general historical changes than scholars in the humanities. I think the boundaries between internal and external still do matter, but they operate at a tactical level and not in anything so general as a division between science and other forms of knowledge, say classics or history. My view would be that scientists respond to a wide range of shifting problems, new questions that are almost always tied into shifts in the wider culture. These arise not just from changes in nature, such as a new disease, but from unexpected opportunities, economic, military, technical, and so forth. Scientific responses to these developments may seem less obviously culturally inflected than other areas of knowledge, but I would suggest that's because science is written to look this way. One of my favorite cases is that of military funding for oceanography that led in the 1960s to the acceptance of continental drift and ultimately to plate tectonics. It was only to insiders, and now in retrospect, that these links are clear. Fourth, it is certainly true that historians, unlike most scientists and engineers, do not work in teams. But as Peter mentions, this is at least in part an effect of modern generic conventions. Narrative is hard to produce when one author is writing. Moreover, viewed in any kind of historical perspective, the focus on teams in science is remarkably recent, really less than a century old. I was actually most puzzled, though, by Peter's point about the history of knowledge being distinct from history of science, because the history of knowledge's focus on the practical and the mundane. As Hans Jorg's paper made very clear, historians of science has been obsessed about, during the past 30 years at least, is about the history of practice and its relation to a whole range of different fields, not just artisanal knowledge, but hunting, cooking, administration, and all the other fields that Peter mentions. So I think here, this is a field in which history of science spreads out equally in relationship to any area of knowledge. The difference is, of course, that knowledge itself, if you take it really seriously, doesn't have a starting point of expertise in the way that history of science does. And that means, of course, that these everyday experiences are things that need to be studied in and of themselves with no reference whatsoever to forms of higher level expertise. In fact, it's this kind of, I think these focus has led, and these problems have led precisely to why there is a debate about whether history of knowledge or history of science is the better term. So if historians of knowledge, in my view, should leap from the pouch of history of science, it would not be because science has any special characteristics internal to itself, but because its history has outgrown and proved too capacious to be contained by the words history of science. And that, as it does for Peter, leads to my final point. I can certainly agree that the goal is a total integrated history. Who could not agree with that? But there remains a need within that larger project to identify what we are doing, just as some historians identify them studying art, religion, or music. Is the history of knowledge the right term for placing our particular studies into the broader field of total history? Although I can see it working in many contexts, I do have concern. Partly, it is because the term knowledge explicitly focuses both highly esoteric, expert kinds of knowledges, such as those that Peter and I have mainly been focusing on, and other forms of knowledge that are much more ordinary, but in many ways more important, such as how to open a door or start a fire. Debates are also ongoing about whether the history of knowledge includes spiritual understandings, superstition, or outright falsehood. I fear that students, university administrators, and the public at large, particularly those at least in the Anglo-American traditions in which I'm familiar, are never really going to get their heads around what the history of knowledge, or indeed the history of knowledges, might be. In contrast, the history of science has at least one clear object: explaining the origins, development, and most powerful form of expertise in our own society. That gives it a genuine political urgency, especially when contemporary understandings of science are so clearly crippled by a lack of historical perspectives. The strength of the history of science is not only the problematic definition of its central term, but also, in fact, its relative lack of a single disciplinary institutional home. If history of science is a discipline, it has shockingly porous boundaries. Practitioners can be found in science studies units, in departments with philosophers and sociologists, and among general historians. In my view, the focus on that elusive category science remains valid and important. To speak of the history of science may be to invoke a present-centered definition. The same is true of the history of religion, art, or literature. I don't see that there is anything wrong about that. It is vital that academic historians tackle issues that really matter for people today. And there is no doubt that science really does matter. Thanks.
Thank you so much. Peter, can I ask for a brief response? We will have time, as said in the first talk, to discuss all the points in more detail in the plenary discussion, but a brief response would be appreciated. Thank you.
Okay, I'm very grateful for Jim's comments, and not least because they give me an opportunity to clear up a couple of ambiguities in my paper. To begin with, I want to emphasize that the 6 contrasts between scientific and non-scientific knowledges were intended as relative, not absolute, differences of degree rather than differences in kind. And it's surely thanks to this, to the very specificity of histories of the natural sciences, that history of science continues to be valuable both as a concept and a practice and an institution. In my view, the history of knowledge, again as a concept, practice, and institution, is not intended as an imperialist enterprise. That is, we don't want to swallow up the history of science. I view it much more as a useful umbrella raised over an extraordinary variety of histories of knowledges, both scientific and non-scientific, both academic and non-academic, from cooking to cosmology. And that's the only comment I want to make.
Okay, thank you very much. It's exactly as timed. So it's now 10 past 11.